Seattle-Tacoma International was packed, as usual. Families hugging at arrivals, people dragging suitcases like they'd just crossed the Sahara, and me, Lauren Graves, trying to keep my eyes open after more than 30 hours of flights and layovers. Okinawa to Tokyo, Tokyo to Los Angeles, Louisiana to Seattle. I smelled like airplane air and cold coffee, and my head felt like it had been stuffed with cotton. I rolled my carry-on to the side, sat on a bench near baggage claim, and opened the family group chat on my phone. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard for a second. I typed, "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" Short, polite, nothing dramatic. I waited. People bustled around me. A kid was having a meltdown over a lost stuffed animal. A couple argued over whether they'd parked in the garage or the open lot, and the smell of overpriced airport pretzels floated through the air. My phone buzzed. It was my dad. "We're busy, try Uber." That was it. No, "Welcome back." No, "Are you okay?" Nothing about the fact that I'd just flown home from my husband's military funeral overseas. Just a quick, dismissive line like I'd asked them to help me move a couch. Then my mom chimed in. "Why didn't you plan better?" I stared at the screen for a moment, letting it sink in. My heart didn't drop, it just stalled. I could almost hear their voices in my head, matter-of-fact and impatient, like this was just another example of me not being organized enough. I typed back, "No worries." 2 words that meant, "You've made your point, I won't bother you again." I put the phone down and focused on the carousel, watching black suitcases go round and round like some hypnotic loop. Mine finally came out, a faded army green duffel with my name stenciled on it from years ago. It had been through more airports than I could count, seen more bases than most civilians could name, and it looked as worn out as I felt. Dragging it outside into the chilly Seattle air, I could see my breath. The line for rideshares was already long, people pulling out phones and glancing around like maybe their drivers had decided to quit mid-shift. I booked one and waited, shifting my weight from one sore foot to the other. The driver showed up in a dented sedan that had seen better decades. He didn't talk much, which was fine. My brain was somewhere between numb and overloaded. Streetlights blurred past as we headed toward my neighborhood, the city half-lit in that damp, gray winter way that makes you forget what season it actually is. When we pulled up to my house, I handed him cash and got out. The porch light wasn't on. The place looked the same from the outside, small, a little weather-beaten, nothing fancy, but it had been empty for months while I was overseas. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and felt a wave of stale air and cold hit me. No welcome home balloons, no casserole waiting in the fridge, no family car in the driveway, just the sound of the heater trying and failing to kick on. I set my bags down and stood there for a moment, listening to the creaks of a house that had been shut up too long. I walked to the kitchen, flipped the light switch, and saw the fridge was completely empty except for a half-used bottle of mustard and a box of baking soda that had expired in 2022. Perfect. I grabbed a glass, turned on the faucet, and got a burst of icy water followed by a metallic taste. Another thing to add to the list. I kicked off my shoes and sat on the couch. It was hard, cold, and a little dusty, like it had been quietly judging me in my absence. My phone was still in my hand. I scrolled back up through the group chat, reading those 2 messages again. "We're busy, try Uber." Why didn't you plan better? There it was in black and white. No misunderstanding, no missing context. Just a complete lack of interest in the fact that I'd just buried my husband thousands of miles away. I'd thought maybe, just maybe, coming home would be a little different, that there'd be at least some sign they cared. Instead, I had silence, cold air, and a mustard bottle that had probably survived the Obama administration. I set the phone down, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. My body was exhausted, but my mind was wide awake. I pulled the old duffel toward the bedroom, letting it drop beside the bed with a dull thud. The zipper caught on the flap, same as it always did, and I tugged it free before pulling out a folded photo from the side pocket. It was one of the few I carried everywhere, me in uniform, Daniel beside me in his marine dress blues, both of us squinting into the sun in front of the base sign at Camp Pendleton. We'd met on a joint training assignment years earlier. I was military police, he was a vehicle maintenance chief, and we'd both been told to keep things professional. That lasted about 3 days. He made some smart remark about my parking job outside the motor pool. I fired back about his coffee being weaker than the Army's budget cuts, and that was it. We weren't a movie couple, no slow motion running, no violins, but we clicked fast. Life in uniform doesn't make dating easy. There were deployments, exercises, training rotations, and the kind of hours that made civilian friends think you were lying. Still, we figured out how to make it work. We traded weekend passes like currency just to grab 2 days together. I learned more about vehicle engines than I ever wanted to, and he learned how to fold a fitted sheet without cussing. After a year, we got married in a small ceremony at the Tacoma courthouse. No flowers, no big reception, just us, a couple of friends as witnesses, and dinner at a seafood place where the waitress brought us a free dessert shaped like a fish. My parents didn't come. My mom said they couldn't get away from work. My dad claimed he'd already been to one wedding that month. I told myself it didn't matter, but the empty chairs in the back row said otherwise. We built a life anyway. We rented a little house near the base. Daniel loved to cook badly, but with enthusiasm, and I planted tomatoes in the backyard, which somehow survived our combined incompetence. Weekends were hikes in the Cascades or movie nights with frozen pizza. People like to think military life is all adrenaline and drama, but most of it is laundry, paperwork, and trying to remember where you left your boots. When I got deployed to Afghanistan, he sent care packages with ridiculous things inside socks that didn't match, gummy bears, and once, a rubber chicken with a note that said, "For morale." I sent him postcards with drawings of the places I'd been, even if they were just dusty streets and crowded markets. We both understood the risks. You don't sign the dotted line thinking it's a safe job. But knowing and feeling are different things. The first time I heard about a casualty in his unit, my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on the stairs. He was fine, but I stopped taking our time for granted after that. When he decided to leave active duty, we thought we'd finally get a taste of normal. He took a job with a defense contractor, Pacific Tech Dynamics, which meant fewer deployments but still the occasional trip overseas. I was honorably discharged and found work as a security consultant, which mostly meant telling corporate people how their emergency plan was really just a binder collecting dust. We settled into a rhythm. Sunday mornings were coffee runs and grocery shopping. We argued over thermostat settings. He liked it cold. I liked to feel my fingers, and we planned trips we never quite took. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. When he got the 8-month assignment in Okinawa, we treated it like an extended adventure. I arranged to visit for 3 months, figuring we could explore the island, eat too much sushi, and spend time together without all the usual interruptions. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. We rented a tiny apartment off base, walked along the beach after work, and tried not to burn ourselves on the yakitori grill at the little place down the street. Being there with him felt like a break from everything. My job, the cold back home, even the nagging awareness that my family barely registered my existence unless they needed something. We didn't talk about them much. Daniel thought they were distracted, and that maybe things would get better over time. I'd stopped expecting that, but I didn't mind pretending while we were there. I kept that photo of us in my wallet, in my locker, on my desk at work. Looking at it now in the quiet of my bedroom, I could almost hear his voice making fun of my serious army face. I set it down on the nightstand, next to the lamp that flickered every time I turned it on. The room smelled faintly of dust, and the heater still wasn't doing its job. I pulled off my jacket, dropped it over the back of the chair, and sat on the edge of the bed. My boots were still damp from the wet Seattle streets, leaving dark spots on the carpet. The weight of the day was settling in, pressing down like an extra layer I couldn't take off. I glanced at the duffel again, thinking about how many airports it had passed through with both our hands on the straps, and how different it felt to carry it alone. I reached over and unzipped the main compartment, pulling out the last few items I hadn't unpacked yet. I laid the last shirt on the bed, smoothing it out before stacking it in the dresser. The drawers still smelled faintly of cedar from the liners I'd put in years ago, the kind my mom used to use when I was a kid. Funny how something like that could make you remember things you'd rather forget. When I was promoted to sergeant and came home for my pinning ceremony, I'd sent my parents an invitation months ahead. My mom replied with a single text. "That's nice." They didn't show. No call, no card. My dad later claimed he'd got the dates mixed up, which would have been more believable if he hadn't posted photos from a fishing trip the same day. I tried to tell myself they just weren't into military stuff, but the truth was harder. They just weren't into showing up. The wedding was another strike. Daniel and I had kept it simple because, well, that's what you do when you're both on active duty, and your schedules are dictated by other people. My mom said she couldn't make it because Kyle's got a big thing that weekend, like my older brother's fantasy football draft was somehow a national holiday. Dad didn't give a reason, he just didn't come. Even the smaller moments showed the same pattern. When I tore a ligament during a training exercise, I called my mom from the base clinic while still in a brace. She listened, said, "Well, don't do that again," and hung up after telling me she had to get dinner started. I was 1,500 miles away, eating lukewarm chow hall food off a styrofoam tray, and somehow she made it sound like I'd just scraped my knee playing in the yard. Holidays were hit or miss. Sometimes they'd invite me last minute, usually when someone else canceled. Thanksgiving at their place was always a performance-perfect table settings. Dad carving the turkey like it was a photo shoot, Mom bragging about Kyle's latest promotion at his insurance job. My service never came up unless someone else asked, and then it was treated like I'd just been traveling a lot for work. I kept making excuses for them. I'd tell myself they were busy, they didn't understand military life, they weren't good at emotional stuff. The reality was simpler. They prioritized what mattered to them, and I wasn't on that list. Still, I kept trying. Sending postcards from deployments, bringing small gifts when I visited, offering to help with projects around their house. Most of it was met with polite disinterest, the kind of lukewarm acknowledgement you'd give a stranger who held the door open. Daniel saw it from the start. "You bend over backward for them, and they don't even look up," he said once after a particularly awkward Christmas where my parents gave me a gift card to a store that had closed months earlier. I brushed it off, telling him they just had a different way of showing they cared. Deep down, I knew he was right, but admitting that felt like giving up on the idea of having a real family connection. Kyle, for his part, played along with them. He liked being the center of attention, and my absence from most family events only gave him more space to shine. If I called him out on it, he'd laugh and say, "Don't be so sensitive." It was easier for him to keep things the way they were, him as the golden child, me as the one who chose a different path, and therefore was expected to fend for myself. One year, I tried to bridge the gap by inviting everyone to the base for a family day event. There were static displays of military vehicles, a K-9 demonstration, and a barbecue. Daniel's parents came, smiling and shaking hands with my friends, asking questions about what we did. My parents RSVP'd, maybe, and then didn't show. No explanation. Later, my mom texted that they'd been tired from the week and decided to stay home. That was the moment I started to see it clearly, not as isolated incidents, but as a long, unbroken chain. Each missed event, each half-hearted reply, each excuse stacked on top of the last until it was impossible to pretend it was anything but neglect. Not the kind that leaves bruises, but the kind that quietly erases you from the picture. I tried to talk to Daniel about it without sounding bitter. He'd listen, nod, and sometimes suggest I take a step back. I'd agree in theory, but find myself sending another holiday card or checking in after a storm hit their area. There was always a part of me that hoped this time would be different, that maybe they'd surprise me with even a small sign they cared. It never came. And standing in my bedroom now, suitcase empty, and the heater still rattling, I could feel that familiar weight settle in again. Not sharp or sudden, but steady. Like carrying something heavy for so long you almost forget it's there. I tossed the cedar-scented liner in the trash, shut the dresser drawer, and went to find the rest of my unpacking. The next thing I pulled from the duffel was a folded paper menu from a yakitori place in Okinawa. It still smelled faintly of charcoal smoke, and for a second I was back there, sitting across from Daniel, while the skewers sizzled on the grill built right into the table. He'd grin every time he managed to turn one without dropping it, like he'd just won some high-stakes competition. When he got the offer for the 8-month contract in Okinawa, we'd both seen it as a chance. He could keep building his civilian career with Pacific Tech Dynamics, and I could spend some real time with him without the constant interruptions we'd lived with during our active duty years. We figured we'd explore the island together, beaches, food stalls, little backstreet shops, and maybe finally use those hiking boots we kept meaning to break in. I flew out a few weeks after he settled in. The apartment was small but perfect for two people who were used to making the most of tight quarters. The view from the balcony stretched out over tiled rooftops and narrow streets lined with vending machines that sold everything from soda to hot canned coffee. We'd wake up early to walk along the seawall before work, the air thick with salt and the sound of fishing boats heading out. Evenings were slow and easy. We'd try a new restaurant or cook together in the tiny kitchen, laughing when we burned something or when the smoke alarm went off for no good reason. On weekends, we'd take buses to parts of the island we hadn't seen yet. Daniel had a way of making even waiting at a bus stop feel like an adventure, usually by inventing absurd stories about the people around us. One night in late November, he came home from work rubbing his temples. "Just a headache," he said when I asked. We ate dinner, watched a movie, and he went to bed early. The next morning, he looked pale, his eyes unfocused. I told him we should go to the clinic, but he waved it off, saying he just needed more sleep. By afternoon, he was worse confused, struggling to keep his balance. I called a taxi to take us to the base hospital. The ride felt like it took forever, the city lights blurring past while I kept talking to him, trying to keep him awake. At the ER, they moved fast scans, blood work, too many people speaking in clipped medical terms. A doctor pulled me aside and said, "aneurysm," and "critical," in the same sentence. They took him into surgery. I sat in the waiting area, my hands clenched together so tightly my nails left marks in my palms. Hours passed. The vending machine coffee tasted like cardboard, and the clock on the wall seemed to skip and stall at random. When the surgeon finally came out, I knew before he spoke. Daniel hadn't made it. The words didn't land all at once. It was like they hovered in the air between us, waiting for me to accept them before they hit. I walked back into the room where they'd moved him, sat beside the bed, and held his hand. It was still warm. I stayed there until someone gently told me it was time to go. The days after were a blur of paperwork and protocol. The casualty assistance officer assigned to me explained the options for burial. Flying him back to the States would be costly and complicated because of the timing, the distance, and the military transport schedules. I could hear Daniel's voice in my head, practical as always. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I chose to have him buried at the U.S. military cemetery in Okinawa. The funeral was small but precise, the way military funerals always are. Rows of white headstones against the green grass, the flag draped over the casket, the sharp notes of taps cutting through the still air. I folded the flag myself, tucking in the corners the way we'd been taught, and pressed it to my chest. No family in the seats behind me. Just a couple of Daniel's co-workers, a chaplain, and the honor guard. Afterward, I walked through the cemetery alone. The air smelled of cut grass and ocean, and the sky had that flat gray tone that made it impossible to tell the time. I traced my fingers over the names on the stones, thinking about how each one was a life that had ended far from home. Back at the apartment, his things were still where he'd left them, boots by the door, a coffee cup in the sink, his jacket draped over the chair. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the jacket, knowing I'd have to pack it into my duffel soon. The silence in that little space was heavier than anything I'd carried in uniform. When I finally started packing, I worked slowly, folding each shirt, wrapping each photo frame in paper, placing everything in neat layers. I'd learned in the army how to pack efficiently, but this was different. Every item felt like a decision I didn't want to make. The yakitori menu went in last, tucked between two shirts so it wouldn't get bent. The day of the funeral started before sunrise. I stood in front of the small mirror in the apartment, buttoning my dark blazer over a plain black dress. My hands moved automatically, like they had so many times before in uniform, but there was no comfort in the routine. I clipped my hair back, checked the flag pin on my lapel, and picked up the folder the casualty assistance officer had given me: documents, program sheets, and the folded itinerary for the ceremony. A van from the base came to pick me up. The driver was a young airman who didn't say much beyond "good morning" and "ma'am." The ride to the cemetery took about 40 minutes. The road curved along the coast for a while, the ocean stretching out in a flat sheet of gray under a low sky. I kept my eyes on the horizon, not because it was beautiful, but because it was the only thing steady in my field of vision. When we arrived, the honor guard was already in position. The rows of white marble headstones lined up with military precision, each one identical except for the names and dates carved into them. A chaplain approached, introduced himself, and explained how the service would go. I nodded at the right moments, holding the program tightly enough to leave creases. They brought Daniel's casket out from the small chapel. The flag was folded perfectly over the top, the colors bright against the muted day. I stood as they carried him to the gravesite, my shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass. The air smelled faintly of salt and fresh earth. The service itself was brief. The chaplain spoke about service and sacrifice, his voice carrying evenly over the wind. A few of Daniel's coworkers stood behind me, hands clasped, their faces set in the way people's faces get when they're trying to stay composed. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because it felt like if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop. When it came time to fold the flag, 2 members of the honor guard stepped forward. They moved in perfect sync, each fold crisp, each corner tucked. Normally this is the part where they present it to the next of kin. In my case, there was no one to hand it to but me. I took it from their hands, the fabric smooth and heavy, and held it tight against my ribs. Taps started. The first note always cuts, no matter how many times you've heard it. It's not loud, but it carries in a way that makes the air feel thinner. The last note faded into the sound of the wind moving through the trees, and that was it. People started to drift away. One of Daniel's coworkers shook my hand and said, "If you need anything, you know where to find me." I nodded, though I didn't. The casualty assistance officer asked if I wanted to stay a little longer. I did. I walked between the rows, reading the names and ages, some barely 20. Every stone represented a whole life, a family, somewhere missing someone the way I was missing Daniel. Some had flowers or small mementos at their base, a challenge coin, a photo in a plastic sleeve, a pair of dog tags hanging from a hook. Daniel's grave had nothing but the fresh mound of earth and the temporary marker with his name. By the time I left, the sky had started to clear. The ocean looked brighter, though it didn't feel any warmer. Back at the apartment, I set the folded flag on the table. I made tea, not because I wanted it, but because making tea gave me something to do with my hands. The rest of the day was paperwork. Forms for the life insurance payout, notifications for his employer, documents for the Department of Veterans Affairs. The casualty assistance officer went over each one patiently, pointing to the lines where I needed to sign. I signed them all, the pen moving in a straight, controlled line like it wasn't my name I was writing. When he left, I stood in the doorway for a while, holding the edge of the flag between my fingers. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Daniel's boots were still by the door, and his jacket was still on the chair where he'd dropped it the night before the headache started. I thought about moving them, but didn't. I sat at the table, the flag in front of me, and looked out the window at the narrow street below. A delivery scooter passed, then a couple walking a small dog. Life outside moved at its usual pace, indifferent to the fact that my own had stopped. I reached over, straightened the edge of the flag, and kept my eyes on the street. The day I left Okinawa, the air was heavy with humidity, even though the sun hadn't come up yet. The taxi driver helped me load the duffel and a small carry-on into the trunk, then drove in silence toward the airport. Streetlights glowed pale yellow over the empty road. I kept glancing at the flag folded neatly in my bag, making sure it was still there, as if it could somehow vanish without me noticing. At the terminal, I checked in, went through security, and found my gate with time to spare. The boarding area smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. People milled around, pulling luggage, juggling passports, looking at their phones. I sat down and sipped from a bottle of water, my stomach too knotted to eat. The first leg took me from Okinawa to Tokyo. It was barely 2 hours, but the plane felt cramped and airless. The man in the aisle seat didn't speak much English, and I didn't feel like talking anyway. I spent most of the flight staring at the safety card in the seat pocket, not reading the words, just focusing on the shapes. In Tokyo, I had a 3-hour layover before the long haul to Los Angeles. The airport was busy, every gate full, the announcements coming in overlapping waves of Japanese and English. I bought a cup of coffee that was too hot to drink right away and found a seat where I could watch the plane's taxi in and out. It was easier than looking at my phone. The flight to LA was over 9 hours. I was in the middle section, 2 rows from the back, with a crying toddler somewhere nearby, and a man behind me who kept kicking the seat. The cabin lights dimmed halfway through, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling the same thought. Maybe things would be different when I got home. By the time we landed in Los Angeles, I'd been awake for over 20 hours. My legs ached, my lower back throbbed, and my mouth tasted like stale coffee. Customs was slow, a long shuffle forward under buzzing fluorescent lights. When I finally got through, I checked the time, still hours to go before Seattle. The LA to Seattle leg was a little under 3 hours, but it felt longer. The plane rattled in turbulence over Oregon, the overhead bins squeaking with every bump. I watched the clouds shift from white to gray to nearly black. When the wheels hit the runway, it was just after 5 p.m. local time. Pulling my phone from my bag, I opened the family group chat. The message I typed was straightforward. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? I stared at the blinking cursor for a second before hitting send. The baggage carousel started moving, suitcases sliding out one by one. My phone buzzed. It was my dad. We're busy, try Uber. A moment later, my mom. Why didn't you plan better? I let the phone drop back into my lap, my jaw tightening. I typed, no worries, and hit send. The words looked casual on the screen, like they could be said with a smile, but my stomach turned. When my duffel finally came around, I grabbed it and headed outside. The air was cold, the kind of damp winter chill that gets into your clothes fast. The rideshare line stretched down the sidewalk. People shifted from foot to foot, breath clouding in the air. My driver pulled up in a scratched-up sedan, gave me a quick nod, and popped the trunk. The heater inside barely worked, sending out bursts of lukewarm air as we pulled away from the curb. I sat back and watched the city blur past strip malls, gas stations, patches of wet pavement catching the glow of streetlights. It wasn't the welcome I'd hoped for, but I kept telling myself it didn't matter. I was home now. The rest I could deal with later. I shifted the duffel slightly, keeping my hand over the side pocket where the flag was stored, and kept my eyes on the road ahead. The driver stopped in front of my house and popped the trunk. I hauled the duffel out myself, slinging the strap over my shoulder. The porch light was off, and the place looked exactly as it had before I left, paint chipping along the trim, a couple of weeds pushing up between the cracks in the driveway. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale and cold enough to see my breath. I hit the light switch, and a single bulb in the entry flickered on, buzzing faintly. The heater didn't kick in. I tried the thermostat, turned it up, and waited. Nothing. The kitchen smelled faintly musty, like something had been left in there too long. I opened the fridge and found a near-empty mustard bottle, a carton of eggs that had passed their expiration date by months, and a box of baking soda that might have been older than my last duty station. I closed it again, leaning against the counter. The sink dripped slowly. When I turned on the faucet, the water came out in a brownish rush before clearing up. I let it run for a while, hoping it would warm, but it stayed cold. My hands ached from the chill as I shut it off. In the living room, dust coated every surface. The couch felt stiff when I sat down, like it had hardened from disuse. I glanced around, half expecting to see something moved or out of place, but it was exactly as I'd left it. Dropping my duffel by the hallway, I went to check the bedroom. The curtains were drawn, and the room was almost as cold as outside. I opened the closet, relieved to see my winter coats still hanging there. The power was on, but the air felt like the heat hadn't run in months. Then I heard a faint gurgling somewhere in the walls. Following the sound to the laundry room, I stepped onto the concrete floor and felt dampness under my socks. A thin stream of water trickled from under the